There is one thing I know about myself. It's that I am easily distractible. A friend called me right after, yeah, right when I was gonna do laundry. Oh no, I shouldn't be on this. Yeah, or when I was gonna do laundry. And then that was a bad idea because it distracted me from what I should be doing, just studying more. Jeez, it's so hard. I don't like how things look right now, and I don't know why. It's the white balance. That makes it look orange. Yeah, 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 yeah. I'll just leave it where it is. Fine. All right. So one thing I wanted to do that I said I was going to do when I got back was to watch this video and react to it. And what I'll probably do is turn this into like a video reacting to this and how I think it's correct or incorrect. But admittedly, I don't know enough Japanese, but I do learn through mostly immersion. I did watch the first video, but I watched that on my own time. But I do want to watch this video because I saw it on the sidebar for this podcast. So I was like, okay, let's see. Let's see what I think about it. All right. Oh, wait. Let's get rid of some things like that. Okay. Yeah, let's see what we find from this video, whether I agree with it, disagree with it. But it's talking about passive listening. I don't know how useful I think passive listening is. I but I haven't done it enough. Or I try to listen to things passively, but it just feels like a waste of time because it feels like I'm not actually doing anything um, in that time. So it's really annoying. Or it feels like I could be listening to other things more actively rather than just having the passive stuff in the background. So it's really hard for me to like put passive time into my life.
Passive listening is the best thing you can do to learn Japanese. Now, about a week ago, I made this video, which I'm sure you've already seen because that's probably why you're here. But it's essentially just a really rough guide on how to do immersion learning and how to learn Japanese with an immersion method. The whole premise of the video was just get mass amounts of exposure and let your brain do the rest, and you'll eventually get good at Japanese. And for this video to make more sense, I would highly recommend going and watching it if you haven't already. Now, one of the ways that I recommended getting a ton of exposure to Japanese for essentially free is by doing something called passive listening. To put it simply, passive listening is essentially just going about your day normally, except you put an earbud in and listen to Japanese passively for as long as you can. Now, if you've never heard of this idea, it might sound crazy at first, like, what? You're just listening to Japanese all day? Why would you do that? Why don't you go study in a textbook or something? Based on the comments of my last video, it seems like not a lot of people have actually been exposed to this idea, so I just kind of wanted to take a deep dive looking into why passive immersion is so beneficial and give you guys some helpful advice on how to make the most out of your time doing it.
He's going to maybe convert the skeptic here because, again, I just don't know how useful passive listening can be over active listening.
Now, to really understand why passive immersion is such a powerful tool, we're going to have to look at the mechanism for which you're actually going to learn Japanese, which is by getting mass exposure to the language and building a deep subconscious understanding of how it works. Now, I basically explained all of this in my last video about how to actually do immersion learning, so I'm not really going to go into every detail here, but the goal is
the only thing I ever do to learn is immersion learning, so I'm fully bought into immersion learning. We'll figure out whether I'm bought into passive learning.
Essentially just to overload your brain with so much language to the point where understanding just comes naturally to you. But before we get into all of that, let me tell a story real quick. Now imagine you're me from 5 years ago and you just quit Duolingo because you're not fluent after 3 days and you're thinking, how the heck?
Duolingo's terrible. Don't use it. My mother uses Duolingo all the time for her studying of language, but I just totally disagree with it as a methodology because you're just memorizing things and it's not. If your only goal is to like travel somewhere and use your like few key phrases or stuff when you are over there is just like a little bit of a random competency boost, then sure. But if your goal is to actually like learn a language, it takes a long time to learn a language. You have to be ready to commit hundreds of hours into it, and just be okay with that.
Hell am I ever supposed to learn this language? A few months pass and you've completely forgotten about seriously trying to learn the language, and instead you're just sitting in your room alone binging the newest episode of some trash isekai anime and watching Abroad in Japan videos on YouTube thinking, God, I wish that was me. Soon after I discovered immersion learning, and then that's when I realized, oh my god, I don't have to use a textbook, I don't have to take a class, I don't even have to study grammar. All I have to do is just listen to Japanese all day and I'll get good. Now, when I first discovered immersion learning, people talked as if the best way to immerse is just to sit in front of a screen attentively and watch content in Japanese for hours a day, and that passive immersion was just a small bonus thing you could do to fill in the gaps in your time. Now I have what some people like to call TikTok brain, so when I told myself, yeah, I can do that, I can watch things in Japanese for hours a day, every day, how hard can it be? I didn't realize the extent of my crippling video game addiction. So, what did I do to solve this? Nothing, I still have crippling video game addiction. Unable to force myself to sit there for hours on end every day consuming Japanese content, I instead just embraced passive listening and turned to audio content for the vast majority.
Okay, this is a really good point, because if he was shitty at active listening and he has learned enough Japanese through passive listening, then this would actually give some validity to this idea of passive listening.
Of my immersion. Now, when you're like me and you have a job that requires driving around in a car all day, you can actually rack up a ton of listening hours because all you really have to do is not listen to music and choose to listen to Japanese instead. You can extrapolate this to any other part of your life where usually you'd listen to music or some other audio content, but instead now you're just going to listen to Japanese. This is basically exactly what I did. I took a gap year from college around the time I was getting into Japanese, and for this entire year I essentially just listened to Japanese while driving around at my job every day and making flashcards to learn words when I was at home. At first I could literally understand nothing. I went into this very blind and with the blind assumption that if I just keep listening to this and keep learning words, I'm going to be able to understand it at some point. Now, this wasn't really the most efficient way to go about things, and honestly, if I had more of a foundation in grammar and vocabulary, then I probably would have gotten better a lot quicker. But by doing this, I essentially just learned that grammar study is completely unnecessary if you don't want to do it. Also,
no, he's totally right here. I don't think you have to do grammar stuff. Your brain's a pattern recognition machine. It figures out where the stuff should go. It's fine. It's just like, doesn't LLM understand grammar? Probably not.
just to be clear, when I say you don't need to study grammar, I mean that you don't need to go memorize all of the rules to it. You still need to be aware that ta equals past tense or that the te form exists, but you don't need to go learn every single rule that governs conjugations. You can learn all of that stuff naturally just by picking it up, and that's what I did. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't recommend studying fundamental grammar because it will definitely give you a head start, but this tells me that the most important thing by far is just getting a ton of exposure to Japanese. During this first year, my comprehension basically went from 0 to being able to understand the general rough meaning of most simple speech about everyday topics. I kept doing this for a few years and progressively kept increasing the difficulty of the things I was learning. Basically went from 0 to being able to understand the general rough meaning of most simple speech about everyday topics. I kept doing this for a few years and progressively kept increasing the difficulty of the things I was listening to until eventually I noticed I was pretty much able to easily understand content made for native speakers. That's basically the short version of how I learned Japanese. I wasn't entirely doing only passive listening, but I would say it was probably around 80 to 90% of all of the time that I spent listening to Japanese.
Wait, 80 to 90% passive? Really? That sounds crazy to me. Huh.
Okay, so you're probably thinking, okay, cool, I get it, but are you actually going to tell us about how long it took, what I should be listening to, how many hours I should be putting in every day, and hold on, I'll get there just a second. The main reason that I just spent all of this time rambling about this is because I really just want to emphasize how powerful something that is seemingly so simple and easy can actually be, and how effective it is to learn Japanese by just doing this simple trick.
Sounds ridiculous.
I know it sounds funny. Learn Japanese using this one simple trick. Japanese language teachers hate him. But honestly, it's true. You don't need to sit there with your head in a textbook memorizing grammar. You really just need to spend as much time as possible listening to Japanese. While we're here, I probably should mention the difference between passive listening and background listening. Passive listening, which is...
Okay, there's difference between background... Okay, yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's some point.
What I'm advocating you do in this video is listening to content while you're doing other things, but you're still giving most of your attention to it and you're trying your best to understand the language coming into your ears. Background immersion, on the other hand, is when you're completely focused on something else, but you still have listening material on in the background that you're not really paying attention to, and
I feel like that's still active listening, his idea of passive listening, because when I was listening to Nihongo Kontebe, I was trying to understand everything that was being said, and then there were some bits that I was like, okay, I'm not going to understand that, and then I just keep doing that. But yeah, I don't know if this distinction matters, because I thought he was just talking about background.
sometimes you might pick up something small here and there that could be helpful, but in reality, it's not really that important, so do it if you want, don't do it if you want, it's not really that big of a deal. Having attention on what you're listening to is really important for this entire process to work effectively, so if you end up zoning out everything, then you're not really going to make much progress. That being said, sometimes you're not able to pay full attention, and sometimes you accidentally zone out and lose track of what you were listening to, and this is normal, so you shouldn't really worry about it too much. It happens to everybody. You just want to get back on track when you notice this happening. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about specifics on what you should actually be doing to make the most out of your time doing this. Now, I got a ton of comments on my last video asking, what should I listen to? What podcast do you recommend? And I did put a spreadsheet in the description that someone in the community made that has like 100 podcasts on it, and I'll link that again here. But I do actually have some recommendations for what you should start out with. Now, in the last video I made, I talked a lot about comprehensible input and how comprehensibility is really important because you need something to cling on to when you're listening, something to make connections with the new information that you're getting. This is why I actually recommend starting with materials that are made for learners, and for like my entire first year of doing immersion learning, I was mostly listening to podcasts that were made for learners, and I made a ton of progress doing this. Now, I do think there's a slight distinction between stuff that is still natural Japanese but ultimately made for learners and things that are essentially just baby talk, for lack of a better word. When I say learner materials, I'm not talking about the stuff that sounds like they're talking to you as if you're a 4-year-old. I'm talking more about the content that's made with the consideration that the people listening are language learners, but without letting that be a detriment to the naturalness of the speech. There are actually quite a few Japanese podcasts made by natives for learners, and if you spend even a second searching, you're going to find a lot of them pretty easily.
Quite a lot.
By far, the podcast that I listened to the most in the beginning was this one called Nihongo Kontepe, which is essentially just a middle-aged Japanese guy talking about random stuff for like 10 to 20 minutes, and there are literally thousands of episodes that he's made.
まあ英語で聞く分にはそんなになんていうかな問題がない感じがしますけど、日本語だったらやっぱちょっと変になるかな、ああいう話し方っていうのはやっぱり言語によって変わりますからね、その捉え方もね。
To me, this was a very good introduction to real Japanese that allowed me to build familiarity with everyday topics and to build a baseline of comprehension up without feeling like I was being talked to like a baby, all while still being easy enough to actually grow my ability at a steady rate. He also has a separate podcast which is specifically made for beginners, but I feel like it kind of falls into that category that I mentioned earlier where it's a little bit like you're being talked to as if you're a 4-year-old. So I would only recommend it to you if you're completely brand new to Japanese, and I wouldn't stick with it for too long. One of the other podcasts that I really enjoyed and felt a significant amount of improvement by listening to was called You Use Japanese Podcast. It's very similar to the previous one that I just mentioned, except I would rate the difficulty of it to be just a little bit more advanced, and there seems to be slightly more diversity in the topics that he discusses.
それよりも3000メートル高い。これどの高さかっていうと、飛行機が飛ぶ高さだそうです。ジャンボジェットで、みんなが日本に行くとき飛行機乗るよね。で飛行機ってめっちゃ高いところ飛ぶじゃんね。そっから外を見るとさ、もう雲ばっかりみたいな、その高さまでこのマダラハゲワシは飛べるそうなんですよ。
These are both great resources, and they helped me a ton when I was building my comprehension to the point of understanding most daily conversation. Like I said earlier, there are actually a lot of these types of podcasts, so I'll put links to a bunch of them in the description, and I encourage you to look around and find ones that you like. At some point, you're going to outgrow the stuff made for learners, and at that point, you're just going to want to start listening to stuff made for native speakers. It doesn't really matter when you start doing this, and honestly, if you're starting to feel like learner materials are becoming easy, then it's better just to jump into content made for natives than to keep waiting. There's going to be a period of time where stuff made for learners feels relatively easy, but stuff made for natives still feels a little bit out of reach, and to break free from this stage, you're just gonna have to jump into native content and figure it out. It's kind of like a sink or swim type thing. Also, it's not a black and white thing where you should only be listening to one or the other. Honestly, just listen to whatever you feel like listening to. If you find it enjoyable, then just listen to that, and honestly, that's gonna be good enough. Okay, so I got a lot of questions asking how you're supposed to actually build comprehension if you understand literally nothing. Like I've mentioned already, you're only going to learn by listening when you understand a word or structure that you wouldn't have understood by itself, but by hearing it in context, you're able to grasp the idea intuitively, and by repeating this cycle for long enough, your comprehension will steadily climb. Now, because doing this process requires a baseline of comprehension, a lot of people ask me how you're supposed to start from zero and just expect to understand. At the very beginning of the process, expecting to understand whole sentences or concepts is unrealistic because you don't know any vocabulary and you haven't gotten used to things like sentence structure or particles. This is why in the very beginning, rather than focusing on trying to understand concepts, you want to just focus on learning the most common words by some other means, and I recommend Donkey for this, and while you're listening, try to be able to pick out those words from within the speech. When you're new to a language, it's pretty difficult to actually listen to the raw sounds and pick out words which you might have already learned already, but because you haven't spent much time with native speech, even hearing them is difficult, and you're often going to completely miss words that you already know the meaning to. Building up the ability to recognize words that you know is essential, so while you're still focused on learning basic vocabulary and grammar, your listening should have a focus on doing that. Something I did a lot to overcome this beginner stage was listening to the same podcast episode many times, each time understanding it slightly.
Yeah, I do that a lot where I'll listen to the same thing over and over again until you're like, okay, I'm understanding little bits more and more. In fact, I've been doing that with where is it? With my comprehensible Japanese at this moment, because I've been watching these 10 videos. I've watched over 5 times each, I think, over and over again, and each time get a little bit more from it. Because some are way harder to understand than others. So, yeah, I'm at that stage.
Slightly better than the previous time that I listened to it. This was helpful because I was able to build a high degree of familiarity with a single piece of content and push the peak of what I could understand higher in a more controlled environment. Now, I've only really mentioned podcasts so far in this video, but there's actually other stuff you can listen to, and one of those is called condensed audio. Condensed audio is essentially just taking an anime or a TV show and shrinking it down to only the dialogue and then turning it into an audio file that you can listen to. I'll put links in the description where you can find out how to do this or where to download ones that people have already made and uploaded. Now, in the comments of my last video, there were a lot of people asking if Japanese music counts as passive immersion
It's way
and
too
asking
hard
what
to
the benefits
tell
of listening
for
to music are.
music.
Now, I'm not going to straight up say that listening to music is useless because it's not, and it's definitely better than listening to things in English. But for the sake of building up your comprehension of spoken speech, it's not really that useful. Music can be a really good motivator, and if you look up the lyrics to songs, then you can learn a lot of vocabulary from music, but I wouldn't really say that it's useful in the same way that listening to spoken speech is. Now, I probably should address the elephant in the room. How much should you actually be immersing every day to make significant progress? Now, the answer is
5
pretty vague,
hours.
but it's always going to be that the more you immerse, the better you're going to get and the faster you're going to get there. A lot of people who say do an immersion method advocate for the idea that you should just be listening 24/7, or at least as much as possible, get like 8+ hours a day. In my experience, this is kind of overkill, and while yeah, it is really effective to listen for 8+ hours a day, you don't actually need to do that to feel significant progress. If someone told you that they were watching TV shows or anime or YouTube for 8+ hours a day, then you probably would think, wow, they're gonna get good at Japanese really fast. Now, the advantage that I think passive immersion and specifically podcasts have is that there is literally zero downtime in what you're listening to. If you're watching anime, for example, then you can assume that at least for a certain percentage of that show, there's going to be a large portion of time where you're
Where
not
they're
listening
not
to
actually
any
speaking,
dialogue,
yeah.
and when you compound that over a long period of watching, then it can actually have a pretty big effect on the results. If you assume that about 40 or 50% of a show consists of bits without dialogue, then by watching 4 hours, you could probably assume that in reality, the amount of language you're actually contacting is closer to 2 hours. In the same way, if you intently listen to podcasts for about 4 hours, the total amount of language you're contacting would be considered about the same as watching 7 or 8 hours of anime. If you consider this, then it's not really that difficult to imagine that if you were to listen to 3, 4, 5 hours of Japanese every day, then it would actually compound into a lot of time with the language, and you would get pretty fast results. This actually happened to me, and I feel like because I primarily did passive immersion where there's no breaks in what you're listening to, I got the same results as people who are watching anime for like 8+ hours a day, even though I wasn't doing as much time as them. Now, don't get me wrong, you absolutely should be spending as much time as possible with Japanese if you're looking to get good results. Ultimately, it's still a numbers game, and you're trying to reach thousands of hours if you really want to get proficient in this language, so the more the better. At the very least, I think you should be going for at least 2 hours of immersion a day, and ideally more if you can, but I know not everyone has the time to do that, so 2 hours I think you can probably get some pretty solid results without putting in too much time every day. Although at the end of the day, learning a language is a huge time commitment, so expecting to do it without putting in that time commitment is a little bit unrealistic. Now, something you can do to keep yourself accountable if you'd like is tracking your immersion, and this is personally something I've been doing for years at this point. There's this website that I use called Toggle Track, which lets you set timers and automatically add those timers to running totals, and then it gives you statistics that you can look at. There's also an app version which I've found to be super convenient and really easy to use, so if you're someone who's into gamifying things, then I would actually really recommend it. There is a premium version, and it might say that you're under a limited trial or you have limited features, but really those limited features are just for people who are using it in big groups or as a team, and for individual use like we're using it for, it's completely unnecessary, so you don't have to pay for anything. The last thing I want to touch on is tolerating ambiguity, and I already mentioned this, but at the beginning of the process, you're not going to be able to understand anything, and it's essential to keep pushing yourself forward in order to see results. It might be hard to force yourself to listen to things that you can't understand very well for hours on end, but building this meta skill of
listening to that too. Was it this Yu? I think it was. How do you actually order this? Oh shoot. I don't know which of these playlists will work. Japan, Japanese culture, social issues, deep talks. Oh my god, some of this is complicated. Casual talks? Probably the casual talks. And this. Native talks. Oh, probably. Okay. I don't like that it has subtitles. Unless it's Japanese subtitles, that would be fine, but okay. But let's finish the video first.
allowing yourself to be okay with ambiguity is really crucial for success. You shouldn't expect yourself to instantly understand things, and if you're going into it with the mindset that you're doing it wrong if you can't understand much, then you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Learning a language is something that takes multiple years of commitment, even when you spend multiple hours a day doing it, so rather than viewing it as a race, it's important to treat it like a marathon and just trust that if you keep going, you'll get there eventually. I really hope this video helped you. If there's one thing that I want to leave at the end of this video, it's that it doesn't really matter what you do, so just chill out, keep listening to the language, and you'll get there eventually. It's not such a serious thing, so don't worry about it too much. If you just keep going, you're gonna get there. Anyways, thank you so much for the support on my last video, and so many people left nice comments, and I just want to say that I appreciate all of them. And if you have anything you really want me to talk about, then leave it in the comments and I might make a video about it. Anyways, that's about it. See you guys later.
I just don't want to use flashcards to get my vocab though, so I've always preferred. How much fire? They almost have 100k subscribers. That's so cool. Good for comprehensible Japanese. Good on them. And they do, yeah, they've been doing pretty well. That's good to hear, or good to see. Neat. Okay. Anyway, let's see. Let's see how I feel. Yeah, let's just watch podcast.
はい、
See how I
皆さん
feel.
こんにちは。ゆうゆうの日本語ポッドキャストへようこそ。
ようこそ。
はい。
Oh, good. It doesn't have English subtitles.
今回はですね、初めてこのチャンネルで顔を出して
はい。
やるっていうのも、今回はミクさんに来てもらって
やった
いろいろこのミクさんのプロジェクトを聞きたいと
はい。
思っています。
はい、よろしくお願いしま。
ますずはじめにこのチャンネルを見てる皆さんに自己紹介をお願いしてもいいですか？
皆さんこんにちは。ミクリアルジャパニーズのミクです。
はい。
はい。いつもね、
うん
日本語を教えたり、
うん
日本語でブログを作ったり、
うん
日本語で他の先生と話したり
うん
してる動画をアップロードしています。
はい。
はい。皆さんよかったら私の動画も見てくださいね。
お願いしますお願いします
はい
はいで実はミクなんですけどもうさんじゃないんだよね実はね
そうですね。
はい
はい。
前一緒に働いていてで一応先輩と後輩ということで
はい。
何年ぐらい？1年半ぐらい
いや 1年ぐらいじゃないです
1
か、
年ぐらいだったかね、
はい、
そう一緒に同じ学校メキシコの日本語学校で働いてたんですよね。
そうですね。
そう、
はい、
で、まあ、今回まあお互いのプロジェクトが始まってから2年とちょっとぐらい、
そうですね。2018年ぐらいです。
3年ぐらいか。
3年ぐらい。
うんということで、まあそのいろいろね、この皆さんにこのミクがどうやってこのプロジェクトをこう作り上げてきたのかとか、まあ、何に気をつけてるのかっていうのを見てもらって、でミクのチャンネルでの動画の見方をね、100倍も200倍もこう楽しんでもらえるようなインタビューをしたいと思っております。
はい、なんか緊張するな。なんかインタビューすることはよくあるんですけど、されることはいやないですね。1回だけかな。はい。
ということで、
はい、頑張ります。
自分を振り返りながらやってみてください。
はい、
はい、ということでそれじゃあいきますよ。レッツゴー。はい、ということで、まあいろいろ聞いていきたいと思うんですが、このチャンネルのタイトルが「ミクリアルジャパニーズ」じゃん。結構そのいろんなね、YouTuber の日本語を教える YouTube のねチャンネルとかってなんとか先生とかなんとか日本語ね、うちらみたいにっていう中で、このリアルっていう言葉を使うのって多分ミクだけなんだよね。
そうですね。
なんかそこはなんかこうチャンネルの名前を決めるときに、あ、これはリアルがいいなと思ってたの。
そうですね。一番最初からなんか日本語を教え始めて、なんか教科書で教えてたじゃないですか。で、まあ学生からも言われたこともあったし、日本語を勉強してる他の国の友達にも結構言われたことがあるんですけど、ミクなんか教科書で2年間日本語を勉強して日本に行ったけど、なんか日本人の友達ができないとか、日本語でカジュアルな会話ができない。
I'm gonna mute the audio here because there's no commentary that I make on here. And if you want to watch the podcast, you should watch it on your own time. Or you can watch it with me or whatever the case may be. But yeah, it makes sense to not just steal other people's content. So I don't want to do that. So, but honestly, I should listen to this podcast more because yeah, I'm at that threshold when it comes to the beginner stuff where the intermediate stuff is still a bit too complicated. So if I just listen to the podcast stuff, that might actually work better. So yeah, should have this on my list. Let me start bookmarking stuff into like, I need a new folder. New folder. Add folder, and we'll call it Japanese. And we'll put some of these channels in there so then I can go to them. Nihongo Kontepe. Japanese. Are there other podcasts that he had? Oh shoot. I don't have this anywhere. I need to This is literally the person being interviewed in this. Jesus, these podcasts have so many listeners. Bookmark that. Then, was there another one that I found that might have been age restricted? I don't think there's anything else. Yeah, one of the issues with having lunch earlier is that, my God, my brain is already tired. And that's not good. It's not good at all for being able to focus. So I might have already wrecked my focus for the day, which is not good. Uh, okay. So, how much can I do? I don't know how much I can do. Cause this is why I'm like, do I even eat in the day if it's just gonna make me tired? Should have napped before this stream. Okay. Let's update this time. Oh wait, I already that. Did I do it that way? 75 for the day. And then yeah. That does make sense. What is the best way forward right now? Into studying. Should just get locked in and then not worry about it. Yeah, I'll just get locked in and not worry about it, to be honest. Okay, I'll splash some water on my face and drink some water first. Nah, never mind. I lied. I need a nap. There's no way. No way. I'm gonna stay focused. So I'm gonna make this particular stream unlisted because there's no point in keeping it on, especially because it didn't have anything very useful for people. Where do I mark that? I don't know where to mark that this should be unlisted after the fact. Visibility. Yeah, I want to make it private. Boop. Boop. And end.